Hello and welcome to our very first remote class. I hope you are faring well in social isolation and that you are at least spending a nice time with your loved ones. And if not, that you are regularly communicating with your loved ones over Skype. So we're going to try our best to replicate what we did in the classroom with these video podcasts. So when you're tired of binge watching your favorite Netflix show, there will be a weekly podcast to look forward to every week where we will try to finish off the last few lectures of this course. So this week, we're sort of turning back to politics. We've been talking about, obviously, the scientific revolution, and so now we're moving back to the nitty-gritty of what's going down in countries. And in this podcast, we're going to talk about how new powers emerge in Europe, in Eastern Europe, that will really change the balance of power in Europe. We're also going to see how European countries and their conflicts begin to spill out over the rest of the world. If they really become global conflicts. The painting that you see in front of you here is the death of General Wolfe at Quebec. You might have seen it in a high school history textbook. This is the famous battle on the Plains of Abraham, where Britain beat France and ended France's involvement in North America forever, and of course changed the course of Canadian history forever. This is just one example of a European conflict that spilled out over into the New World. So we're going to be talking about all of that, and really this is important because we are moving forward to the big event, the event of the French Revolution, which is where this course comes to an end. And it's that demarcation point that I've been talking about, that moment where the world pivots into the modern world. So this is really setting the scene of what the state of Europe was like right prior to that moment. The learning objectives for this unit are: number 1, recognize the new balance of power in Europe. That is the post-Westphalian political order. That's a great term, post-Westphalian. So if you remember, the 30 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Westphalia. And so historians love to come up with really fancy, smart-sounding words. So post-Westphalian really is just simply saying the way things were after the 30 Years' War. Number 2, we're going to look in the West at France and Britain, how they emerged as economic and military powers. And we haven't done anything really in Eastern Europe in this course, and we're going to now look at Eastern Europe. So we're going to look at how some new military powers, namely Austria, Prussia, and Russia, emerge as military powers during this time period. Number 3, we're going to understand how overseas trade, colonization, and slavery expanded dramatically. This is tied to what I was saying before, how European conflicts spread out over the world. And we're going to talk about how the 18th century agricultural revolution and changes to textile production and their consequences, how all of this is laying the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution, which is a massive social change that we won't be talking about in this course. That you will have to take the second half of this course, which is also online, and it looks like our lives are going to be online for a lot longer, so something to consider for a future term. So let's continue along. So the 30 Years' War ends in 1648, and if you recall, it had involved nearly every country in Europe in what began essentially as a civil war within the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire had always been, a somewhat looser amalgamation of princedoms. But after the 30 Years' War, it really ceases to be a major power. But what happens is there are component parts of the Holy Roman Empire which break away and essentially become powers in and of their own right. Although the Holy Roman Empire will technically continue to exist all the way up until the time of Napoleon. In fact, it'll be Napoleon that will finally put the final nail in its coffin. But the component parts of the Holy Roman Empire, well, they continue to be powerful. So Europe in 1648 is ripe for a complete repositioning of countries. Prior to the 30 Years' War, Spain and the Habsburgs in general had been the most powerful force in Europe. After the 30 Years' War, we would see France in particular step to the table, but other countries too. So I want to introduce you to some very powerful dudes who will essentially reshape Europe over the next several decades. Okay, so some of these guys you already know. So obviously Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, we've spent a lot of time talking about him. So after the 30 Years' War, he really will reshape France into becoming one of the most powerful countries of Europe. And in fact, there'll be several wars fought which involve most of Europe, essentially trying to stop Louis from becoming more powerful. You've also met, although we didn't discuss him too much, William III of Orange. He becomes King of England when he and his wife, Mary Stuart, the daughter of James III, come over in the Glorious Revolution and remove James II from power, and he becomes King of England. England also will, in the years after in the early 18th century, will be amalgamated with Scotland and Ireland and become Great Britain. And people who you haven't met yet are people in the East. So Leopold I, he was the Holy Roman Emperor. That was his one of his titles. He was a Habsburg, but more importantly, he really controlled Austria and Hungary. And it was really in his role there that he is a figure that was someone to be reckoned with. And also new people that you haven't met yet: Frederick William of Prussia, and Peter the Great of Russia. So by the time we get to the early 18th century, which is, this map is, I think, 1715 in Europe, and this is after those guys I just introduced you to had finished mucking around in Europe, we really see a completely rebalanced Europe in terms of power. So Spain obviously is no longer a serious force to be reckoned with. The Holy Roman Empire is really just a loose amalgamation. It's a shell of its former self. There's like 300 little principalities in it. However, component parts of the Holy Roman Empire have become important. So I'm going to draw your attention here to Brandenburg and Prussia, which are united under the same family controls them. We're going to be talking about Brandenburg, Prussia. The Brandenburg part of it was essentially a part of the Holy Roman Empire. Was one of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire. Prussia was not. Prussia was a fiefdom of Poland, but it will break away, as we'll see. Brandenburg, Prussia will become super powerful in the years to come. Also, another component part is Austria, which is controlled by the Habsburgs, and they also control Hungary, which is outside of the Holy Roman Empire. But that amalgamation, Austria-Hungary, will become super powerful. We'll also see Russia over here. Russia will continually gain power. We haven't talked about Russia before because really they don't play a major role in European politics prior to this period. But beginning in the 18th century, Russia begins to expand at the expense of Poland and Sweden and other countries, and they definitely become a force to be reckoned with. So the first country that I want to talk about that emerges as a serious power in Central and Eastern Europe is Austria. And now Austria was controlled by the Habsburgs. And in 1648, at the end of the 30 Years' War, the Habsburg family directly controlled, now this is important because they often are Holy Roman emperors as well. But if you recall, Holy Roman emperors don't directly control all of the lands in the Holy Roman Empire, especially not after the 30 Years' War, because really the role of Holy Roman Emperor is like being student council president. Like, you don't really get to do much in that role. But it's the lands that they directly control which matter. And so the lands that the Austrian Habsburgs directly controlled was what is now essentially modern-day Austria, and then Bohemia, and a small part of Hungary in 1648. And the leader that is really important in the half century after the 30 Years' War is Leopold I, and you see a painting of him there. Technically, in his role as Holy Roman Emperor, he was the longest serving. He ruled 46 years and 9 months, which is quite impressive. Leopold was nicknamed Hogmouth, which is not very nice at all, but he did have a very pronounced chin, which I guess is why people made fun of him. The Habsburg chin is rather famous. There's another a picture of him on a coin, and you can see a very, very pronounced chin. Now, what really changed Leopold's fortunes was when Austria went to war with the Ottoman Empire. The Austro-Ottoman War between 1683 and 1697 would see Austria reconquer most of Hungary at the expense of the Ottomans, and it would essentially end the Ottoman control over much of Eastern Europe. So the Ottoman Empire has been a force to be reckoned with from the point of view of Europe for some time, ever since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Now, I know that I talked about how the Battle of Lepanto, which was the last battle fought with those big boats with the oars, it was fought between Spain under Philip II and the Ottomans. That was a defeat for the Ottomans, and that was also, some people have discussed that was also a part of their decline. But really, no one can deny that the Ottoman Empire is in decline after this war with Austria, because at this point, they have been pushed out of Europe. Now, Leopold didn't just fight the Ottomans. He was also often at war with France, which was controlled by his first cousin, Louis XIV. Everyone is related amongst the nobility, if you haven't already figured that out in Europe. Anyway, he was often at war with France, and this was partially because Louis was often at war with everyone else. We already talked about this. So Louis was, constantly picking fights. He had grand ambitions and a big ego, and so France was always going to war. The Franco-Dutch War was one war that Austria got involved in, but then also the 9 Years' War. This was the League of Augsburg, the Protestant Avengers War. Remember that one? And also the War of Spanish Succession. This was the war that Louis XIV fought, essentially because he wanted to see his grandson become King of Spain. Incidentally, the War of Spanish Succession, Austria-Hungary fared fairly well. So the Habsburgs gained control of essentially the Spanish Netherlands, which is modern-day Belgium. So now you see on that map there, all the yellow then is controlled by the Habsburg family. So we see Bohemia, Austria, Hungary, and the Spanish Netherlands. And then, of course, yes, also parts of Italy as well. Okay, so we've talked about Austria being this major power that comes to be. Let's turn to Brandenburg, Prussia now. So Brandenburg, Prussia, you're probably thinking to yourself, what the hell is Brandenburg, Prussia? I've never heard of Brandenburg, Prussia. That's because it doesn't exist as a country per se now, although it's made up of other places obviously today. But let's talk about what it is. So Brandenburg, let's talk about the Brandenburg portion of it first. So I'm just going to circle it here. This is pretty neat. The PowerPoint can do this. Look at that. Boom. So Brandenburg was technically part of the Holy Roman Empire. And as such, it was considered an elector of the Holy Roman Emperor. Now, if you recall way back when we first talked about the Holy Roman Empire, technically each of the little princedoms within it had one vote. So they were an elector to who would be the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. They had one sort of say. And in that sense, Brandenburg was part of it. Prussia, on the other hand, which is not even connected by land, it's over here. Prussia was a duchy or a fiefdom of the King of Poland. Now, if you recall from the Middle Ages what a fief is, or a fiefdom, it means that whoever was the noble that controlled Prussia in the Middle Ages technically was a vassal of the King of Poland and owed military service as such to the King of Poland. Now, once we get into the 16th and 18th century, 17th, 18th century, obviously these relationships have changed considerably. But often the legal arrangements still exist. And so in that sense, Prussia was a fiefdom to Poland. Incidentally, Poland, it says Poland-Lithuania. We'll get into that in a little bit, but Poland and Lithuania were actually united at this point in time under the same control, the control of the same family. So your next question might be, why are we talking about Brandenburg and Prussia together when they're clearly separated? I can see that they are not part of the same country. That is because Brandenburg and Prussia were both controlled by the same family, the Hohenzollern family. They were so the two states were united by marriage. So we can consider them essentially as a single entity. During the 30 Years' War, Brandenburg played almost no role whatsoever at all. It was not powerful, and in fact, other people, basically just stomped right over it. Sometimes, in fact, it's referred to as the sandbox of Europe. It was weak and powerless, but this was about to change. Okay, sidebar, because I know you're thinking it. Why do Russia and Prussia have such similar names? Like, that's really freaking confusing. So, first of all, they actually don't have similar names. It's just in English that they do. If we actually look at how they're pronounced in their respective languages, they sound quite different. So, Russia in Russia is, and I'm going to, not do a very good job of this. So if you're Russian, if you speak Russia, please forgive me. It's Russia, Russia, and Prussia, as pronounced in German, is Preußen, Preußen. And now those, to my ear anyway, don't sound very similar at all. So you can just imagine British cartographers wandering around Europe, renaming things so that English people have a better time or an easier time saying them. So you may be wondering, well, how do these two words come to be in the first place? The etymology of them is interesting. So the etymology of Russia is the land of the Rus, and the Rus were Vikings from Scandinavia. So that's interesting. You maybe didn't realize that Vikings they didn't just settle in Normandy, they also settled in Russia. They were all over the place, those Vikings. They were even in Newfoundland. Prussia is a little bit more confusing. We don't entirely know what the etymology of Preußen is. One possibility is that it is derived from Proto-Balto-Slavic, which is a reconstructed language. We have no idea for sure how it sounded, and that would be Proshka, which means, we think, watery land. So I guess that means that Prussia was kind of swampy. Anyway, so they don't really have similar names in other languages. It's just in English that they have similar names. Okay, so turning back to Brandenburg, Prussia. The main reason why Brandenburg, Prussia went from being the sandbox of Europe, as it was called, to being one of the most powerful states is largely because of this guy, Frederick William. Frederick William was known as the Great Elector, which sort of befit his status. Remember that Brandenburg was technically an elector of the Holy Roman Empire, so that's what that's referring to. So he came into power towards the end of the 30 Years' War. And the 30 Years' War, of course, towards the end, it had ravaged much of Europe. And in the years following, Frederick William focused on rebuilding his territory. He did that by first building a standing army of 40,000 soldiers by 1648. He also made a point of following sort of a different path than France had, whereas in France, Louis XIV and his ministers had largely bypassed the old nobles. Frederick William decided to work with them. And so he allied himself with the nobles. The nobles in German-speaking lands in Europe were often known as Junkers, which just, the word comes from Junge, which means a knight or a young man. So he allied himself with the Junkers and built a massive army. He did so by allowing the nobles to be exempt from taxation, and in return, the nobles allowed him to get rid of some of the things that were checking his power. For instance, Brandenburg Prussia also had an Estates General like France, and under the agreement with the nobles, he was able to dissolve it. So his next task was to get out from underneath Poland. So remember that Prussia was technically a feudal vassal of the King of Poland. And so when Sweden and Poland went to war with one another in 1657, he allied himself with Sweden, which was, breaking his feudal oath. But it allowed him to gain a powerful ally, and Poland at that point was getting weaker and weaker. And this allowed Brandenburg Prussia to completely remove itself from the control of Poland after the war. And then in the next few years, Brandenburg Prussia would actually become one of the most powerful states in Europe. So let's talk for a moment about Poland, or Poland-Lithuania, as it was known at that time. Poland-Lithuania had been united during the Middle Ages because the royal family had a marriage had brought those two countries together. During the Middle Ages, that had been an important economic region because for the rest of the West, that was where they got a lot of their raw resources. So trade in the Baltic region brought with it timber, furs, iron, and copper. However, whereas in other places in Europe, as we move out of the Middle Ages, we saw kings become more powerful, Poland and Lithuania is really an exception to that. They did not have an expanding royal power. Part of the reason for this is that Poland Lithuania always was made up of many, many different groups of people. It was a multi-ethnic state, and its only really ties between the two regions was this marriage of the royal family. Generally speaking, it remained in sort of that medieval power distribution where you had a weak king and very strong nobles. So generally speaking then, once we move into the early modern period, Poland-Lithuania really is losing power compared to its neighbors. It's becoming weaker. And then a series of uprisings and wars really sort of set it back even further. So first there was an uprising of the Cossacks, who were a farmer warrior people that were in their territory in 1648. And that was followed by a massive war between 1655 and 1660, sometimes called the Second Northern War. The Northern Wars are a little bit confusing. There's a lot of them. In any respect, what was important about this war was it essentially broke apart Poland and Lithuania. So Sweden invaded, and Russia, which also, not that they wanted to necessarily support Poland and Lithuania, but they didn't want to see Sweden become more powerful, they invaded on the Lithuania side, and in the end, Poland-Lithuania was really a shell of its former self. So following the war, most of Lithuania was lost, and Poland, now alone, lost much influence in the region. And Poland really from that point onward is no longer a major power in the Baltic region. So now let's take a look at Russia. So Russia is becoming super powerful during this time period, and it's largely because of this guy, Peter the Great. Now, the first thing you need to know about Peter is that he was crazy tall. The man was 6'8". He stood over 2 meters in height, so he was literally heads and shoulders above most of the men who were alive at that time period. If he was alive today, he would probably be an amazing basketball player. So Peter was particularly impressed with the changes in terms of the power of kings that were going on in the West. He looked to France in particular and emulated a lot of the techniques that people like Cardinal Mazarin and Cardinal Richelieu had put into place to make kings like Louis XIV more powerful. And one of those ways was to bypass the old nobility by elevating new nobles that will be loyal only to yourself. These new nobles, of course, were coming from the merchant classes, and they lacked a noble name, but you could give them that, and in return, they were loyal. And you got rid of the old nobles families who might cause you trouble. Now, one of the other interesting things about Peter is that Peter actually was quite influenced by a lot of the new ideas that were coming out of the Enlightenment. Now, let's be clear. He wasn't really that interested in ideas in the Enlightenment like social contract type ideas, which would limit powers of kings or encourage democracy or equality. No, 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 no. None of that sort of stuff. But Peter was impressed with ideas of improving efficiency in bureaucracy and modernizing the state. Those type of things he could get completely behind. And so that's exactly really what he did. In many ways, he led a cultural revolution of sorts in Russia, trying to modernize it as much as possible. He's what some historians would call an enlightened despot. That is someone who is all-powerful, but at the same time cherry-picking this and that from Enlightenment ideas to modernize one state, but certainly not taking all of the Enlightenment ideas. So he put into effect all kinds of reforms of his state, of his bureaucracy, and in particular his military as well. So for example, Russia had never really had a navy at all, at least certainly not a powerful navy, and he pretty much created a Russian navy from scratch. He also instituted military conscription, building up a standing army that he could control. He also made Russia manufacture their own firearms so that they could be independent of other states. Now, the problem with having a navy is that you actually have to have some access to the sea, and thus comes along the idea of St. Petersburg. So, if you recall, when we talked about Louis XIV, we talked about how when he built the Palace of Versailles, everyone thought it was a bad idea because he wanted it built in a terrible location in a swamp. But because Louis XIV was the Sun King and he was an absolute ruler, well, what Louis wanted, Louis got. And so everybody had to figure out a way to do this, and at great expense, they built Versailles in the middle of a swamp. Well, that's sort of what Peter did with St. Petersburg. So St. Petersburg is on the Baltic in a frozen swamp. And so at a tremendous expense, he had St. Petersburg built on a frozen swamp. And this allowed Russia to have access to the Baltic Sea, and in the south, Russia also pushed towards the Black Sea, gaining sea access in both areas. So I want to move now from talking about the new powers in Eastern and Central Europe and move to start talking again about the state of European exploration and colonization. So several weeks ago, we talked about how Spain had been the first European country to start setting up colonies in the New World. The other European country that was also pioneering new trade routes was Portugal. Now, Portugal had been the first European country to successfully sail around the Horn of Africa. And that meant that Portugal got a head start on all the other European countries in going the other direction towards the markets of India and China. So Portugal had set up trading routes. You see the green all around Africa here. I'm just going to draw around here. So this route here essentially was dominated by the Portuguese. It also meant that Portugal was the first European country to really get heavily involved in the slave trade. And so all along Africa here, they set up trading posts where they would trade for slaves. And Portugal set up trading posts into Southeast Asia here as well. Portugal eventually did start to set up colonies as well in the New World. And so you can see here the little bit of green here along the coast of what is now modern day Brazil. Portugal started to set up colonies there. And as you can see, everywhere here that is in red is under Spanish control. Now, I suppose this is interesting if you know the languages of South America and Central America. Spanish is by far the main language of Central and South America, but of course Brazil, which is roughly here, is Portuguese. And now you know why, because that was where the Portuguese were setting up their colonies. So one of the reasons why we saw the pattern that we did in that last map between Spain and Portugal was because of a series of agreements that were enacted in the late 15th and early 16th century that were essentially negotiated with the Pope, which essentially split the world between Spain and Portugal. The main one was the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. So essentially it split the world in half, and on this side of the world this would be Spanish territory, and on this side of the world this would be Portuguese territory. Note that you can see a little bit of South America here, which would be on the Portuguese side, and this is where Portugal set up their territory, which would later become Brazil, where Portuguese is still spoken to this day. Now, needless to say, this didn't involve any other European country, and they did not consider this treaty valid, and they didn't really pay much attention to it at all. And after the Protestant Reformation, the fact that this was a Catholic treaty that was made and negotiated with a Catholic Pope really just meant that it didn't mean anything. So during the 16th century, when Spain was all powerful, eventually Portugal was actually gobbled up and controlled directly by Spain for between 1680 and 1580 and 1640, sorry. And eventually Portugal would break away between 1640 and 1668 when they rebelled against Spain. But this is really in the 17th century when Spain is losing its power. Now, the reason I bring this all up is because today we're going to be looking at the other European countries and how they, although they got a late start at it, start to set up their own colonies, which are in direct competition to the Spanish colonies. And as Spain begins to lose power, they begin to ascend power because of their colonies. So other European countries initially focused their colonies on North America because this was the area which Spain hadn't already set things up. And so by the early 17th century, France had a colony along the St. Lawrence River, New France. New England had a very large set of settlements that stretched all the way from parts of what is now Nova Scotia, all the way down the eastern seaboard of what is now the United States. The Netherlands also had set up their own small colony, New Netherlands. They had one really important settlement, of course, which was New Amsterdam on the Hudson River. And New Amsterdam, of course, becomes, guess, New York City, and it's still there today. And believe it or not, New Sweden even existed. The Netherlands and Sweden didn't keep their colonies. Over time, they both of them lost their colonies through war, and we really just have England and France. But the Netherlands also weren't really that focused on North America. The Netherlands, in many ways, were going the direction where the Portuguese had towards Southeast Asia, and they would eventually completely supplant the Portuguese in that direction. So the Netherlands, or the Dutch, set up one of the sort of first private-public partnerships. They licensed a private company, the Dutch East India Company, to be able to, on behalf of the Netherlands, set up trading posts, and in return the company would have exclusive rights to the trade coming through there. Here you see an image of William III, who would eventually become King of England, and he used resources that he gained from the Dutch East India Company to fund his wars against Louis XIV. In many ways, this meant that the Netherlands, at least economically, became really, really powerful during the 1600s. Some historians have gone so far as to call it a Dutch golden age until the year 1700. And here you see on the map just how extensive those Dutch trading routes were. They had trading routes which went to South America, but the more important trading routes were the ones that went around the Horn of Africa and into East Asia. So turning back to North America, England and Spain really worked very hard to expand their settlements in North America after the year 1700. And so here you see in a map, the green area is New France, and the yellowish area, orangish area is New England. Now, although you would look at this map and you'd say, wow, New France is really quite large, it's doing really well, the reality is actually the New England settlements were much more successful for a bunch of reasons. So I'm going to talk about New France and New England separately now. So the English settlements got off to a fairly rocky start in the early 17th century with the first colony that they created, which was Virginia. In Virginia, they had several failed settlements where the settlers starved. They also had an incredibly aggressive and hostile relationship towards the local indigenous peoples. Now, generally speaking, all European countries had hostile and aggressive relationships with the indigenous peoples, but that the English had a very different strategy than the French did with respect to indigenous peoples, which I'll explain in a moment when we turn to New France. But this certainly didn't make it easier for them. However, the English did adopt a successful strategy when it came to increasing the population of their settlements once they were created. So they took advantage of the fact that in England there was religious plurality, meaning that there were more than one Protestant groups, but the main Protestant group, which were the Anglicans, generally speaking, excluded from public life people who were part of the minority Protestant religions. So the English crown offered to these minority Protestant religions the opportunity to move to the New World and be able to practice their Christian faith openly. And this allowed for people who had differing religious views or simply were unemployed in England. These were incentives for them to move to the English colonies and become part of the population there. The quicker that England could move population there, the quicker they could displace the indigenous people, and the quicker they could outpace the French. The two groups in particular that we see in New England were Pilgrims and Puritans, two religious minorities from England. And very quickly, their strategy was successful. The population in the settlements very quickly outpaced New France. And by the time we get to the late 1600s, early 1700s, the English colonies all along the English seaboards are very well developed. I mean, there's several series of towns well connected with transportation networks and fairly large populations compared to New France. So France, compared to England, had a very low population in their colony. And part of the reason for that is just a different emphasis. Whereas the English emphasized on moving people over there as quickly as possible to settle the area, France was really focused on the fur trade and on missionary activity, that is, converting indigenous people to Christian faith, rather than colonization per se. Now, this may seem strange, though, when you look at the map, because you see this large green area that is considered New France, which is arguably much bigger than the English settlements. But that area is almost completely wilderness. Really, the only regions that France had settlements were here in Acadia, right there, which is now present-day Nova Scotia. That was where their first settlements are. And then their main settlements were really along the St. Lawrence River right here. Their three main settlements being Trois-Rivières, Quebec City, and Montreal. And then beyond that, there's really nothing from the point of view of European settlements. So the way that the French were pushing into the interior was through the coureurs de bois. And coureurs de bois means literally the runners of the woods. And who these were essentially fur traders and entrepreneurs. These were not official state representatives of the king. These are essentially men who have decided to push into the wilderness, to develop relationships with the indigenous peoples, to create trading networks and bring those goods back into port so that they can be taken into Europe. Essentially, it's a money-making venture. But they're not interested in setting up towns or anything like that. This was a problem from the point of view of the crown because they had no control over how the coureurs de bois were representing their interests. On one level, they were pushing a French presence into the interior of North America, but they had no real control over how that French presence was being represented. Generally speaking, the French took a more cooperative approach, and I use this in quotation marks because they still were fairly hostile towards indigenous peoples at many times, but compared to the English, a more cooperative approach with the indigenous tribes because they were focused primarily on the fur trade, which meant that they had to develop relationships with the indigenous people. However, with the English settlements quickly outpacing the French settlements, this is a big problem. So in 1664, Louis XIV decided that he was going to do something about it, and he took direct control over the colonies. So the biggest problem with increasing population, well, they could move people there, but the other problem is that the existing population was entirely men. And of course, that's not going to help matters in terms of increasing population. They had to figure out a way to encourage women to move to New France. And so one of the techniques that they ended up adopting had to do with dowries. So if you know what a dowry is essentially the inheritance that a woman carries from her father or her family into a marriage. And culturally at that time, you could not get married if you were a woman if you didn't have a dowry. So that meant that poor women or women who didn't have a dowry or who were orphans, there was almost no chance that they would get married. And as we've already talked a little bit in this course, for women, when you're outside of a marriage structure, you're legally very, very vulnerable in society. So it's not a great place to be. The best that you might hope for was being a servant if you were, a poor person, a poor girl who wasn't married. So in 1664, when King Louis XIV took direct control of the colonies, they came up with a plan to encourage poor women to move to the New World and to become the wives of all these fur traders that were living there, fur traders and soldiers. They were called the filles du roi. And essentially what they were offered was that they would be given a dowry from the king. They would essentially become the daughters of the king. That's what filles du roi means. And in return for that dowry, they would go over and then they would hopefully marry a fur trader. And so thousands of women took them up on this offer, and they sailed over to New France. And when they landed, they literally had the 18th century equivalent of cocktail parties where they would get a chance to meet fur traders, and hopefully, there'd be some romance and they would get married, and it was a grand success. So if we look at the population that we think around 1700 of New France was around 15,000 people, approximately 60 years later, that population had grown to 70,000 people. And this was almost entirely because of people being born there, not people emigrating there from France. And in fact, if you have any Quebecois Canadian blood in you, you almost certainly have a filles du roi in your ancestry. It's that prevalent in the genealogy of people who are Quebecois. So the other thing that we see during this time period is a shift on how the colonies are moneymakers from the point of view of European countries. So when Spain originally set up their very first colonies and conquered the Aztec Empire, they were focused almost entirely on the extraction of metals, because happy coincidence from the Spanish point of view, when they arrived, the Aztecs also prized some of the same things that Europeans did, gold and silver, particularly silver. And so there were already existing silver mines, and the Spanish were able to simply just take these over after they conquered the Aztecs. And this influx of silver essentially made Spain incredibly wealthy during the 16th century, and that was why we talked earlier in the course how that was when Spain became essentially a superpower during the early modern period, and it was called the Spanish Century. However, eventually the easily extractable metals ran out. And so that was not the main source of commerce from that point onward. And instead, we see a shift to new cash crops, new commodities, such as tobacco, which Europeans had never encountered tobacco until they came to the Americas. Sugar, which although Europeans had limited exposure to sugar. Sugar can only be grown in very specific, narrow climatic conditions, which did not exist in Europe. So Europeans in the Middle Ages, if they had sugar, it would be somebody incredibly wealthy and would have been brought at great expense from somewhere very, very far away in Asia. But now Europeans could set up sugar plantations in colonies that they directly controlled in the Americas, and this became another cash crop for them. And another cash crop, of course, was chocolate. And chocolate, or cacao, which is what chocolate is made from, was another North American crop that Europeans had never had any exposure to before, but it became quite popular. And that also became a source of profit as well for Europeans. So this is when the Europeans set up essentially the plantation system. These are huge farms that were creating these cash crops. Now the problem is how do you get people to work on these farms? Because you can't really make much money if you're paying them money. So thus we see the beginnings of the slave trade. Now, originally Europeans tried enslaving the indigenous peoples of the Americas, but that didn't work out so well because the indigenous peoples kept dying on them because, of course, the Europeans were bringing with them all sorts of old world diseases to which the indigenous people had no natural immunity to it. So they needed to find a different population that they could enslave, an old world population that would be able to do this work, that wouldn't be dying from their diseases. And unfortunately, that was African peoples. And so the slave trade in Africans begins to form the bedrock of the plantation economy during this time period. The slave trade would last for centuries, and the horrors of it really can't be expressed in a PowerPoint lecture. Millions of men, women, and children were taken from their homes and forcibly packed onto slave ships, which were just incredibly awful conditions. This is an image of one British slave ship from the 18th century, and the plan there showed how 454 slaves would be accommodated on board, and essentially they were strapped to wooden boards and stacked like wood, essentially on top of one another. And there are reports that in this particular slave ship they even carried as many as 609 people. The slave, and once you arrive, if you were lucky enough to even survive the voyage, which very few did, they simply worked on a numbers game by putting as many people as possible into these slave ships, expecting that many of them would die. Your life on the plantation would be equally harsh and horrible. The slave trade would be the defining characteristic of the mercantile economy of cash crops for much of the 18th and even a little bit of the early 19th century. So here is an example of a sugar plantation. Sugar manufacturing in the Caribbean colonies required large amounts of capital, like money outlay, in part because the raw sugar cane had to be processed very quickly on site to avoid spoilage. This scene depicts enslaved workers operating a small sugar mill on the island of Barbados in the 17th century. In the background, a press crushes the cane, and in the foreground, the juice from the cane is being boiled down until the sugar begins to crystallize. The slave trade and the trade in cash crops essentially created by necessity something that we call triangular trade, and this existed for the better part of 200 years. Essentially, the way triangular trade worked is the ships would be kept in motion all the time to increase efficiency. So ships laden with manufactured goods would sail from Europe to Africa. Those manufactured goods would be traded for slaves. Then the slaves would be brought into the Caribbean and into North America. And in the Americas, then they would pick up raw materials such as sugar or products from sugar such as rum. And that would in turn be brought back to England to be sold. Also, England would send manufactured goods to the colonies as well to be sold to their colonists. So this is an adaptation of the mercantile system that we talked about earlier in the course called triangular trade. As these colonies become more and more developed, these colonies also start to become sources of conflict in and of themselves. And in fact, some of the wars that European countries fought between one another actually originated in the colonies. And the one that's most important from the point of view of Canadian history, I suppose, is the French-Indian War, or otherwise known as the 7 Years' War. This is the war which was between Britain and France, which would end French occupation in the New World. New France would be lost. This is the war that would have the fateful Battle of Quebec, where General Wolfe on the English side and General Montcalm on the French side would both die, and Quebec now would be under the control of the British from that point onward. And so for a brief period of time, after the 7 Years' War, after 1763, Britain controls all of North America. It doesn't last very long because in 1775, the American War of Independence breaks out. And what is absolutely crazy and absolutely bizarre, and we'll talk a little bit about it more in our discussion on the Enlightenment next week, but the British were actually defeated. And partially they were defeated because the French were so pissed off at the losses from the 7 Years' War that they sent lots of money to the American colonists to help them out in their war against the British. So the French heavily funded the American War of Independence. The irony, of course, was that the American War of Independence was an Enlightenment revolution. It was based on Enlightenment ideals such as democracy and equality under the law, that sort of thing, which of course would come back to haunt the French because they would be dealing with their own revolution just a few years later, the French Revolution. We also see a transformation of the military during this time period. There's more reliable guns, more reliable muskets. We see the sword give way to a bayonet, which were fixed at the end of the musket. And these new types of weapons required greater training and greater discipline. And so this essentially means that we need to create professional soldiers. Countries increasingly rely on conscription to fill the ranks of soldiers. We also see the expansion of navies. With all these colonies, it becomes important to protect your shipping lines, and navies become essential to expressing your power. This results in the decline of piracy. There actually was a brief period of time where there was quite a bit of piracy in the Caribbean. So Pirates of the Caribbean, that world that's created in those movies, there was sort of a brief time period where that actually roughly approximates that. But the expansion of navies in the late 18th century essentially rendered that brief period of piracy null and void. Now, getting people to serve on these Navy ships was actually quite difficult because life on a Navy ship was downright miserable. And so generally what countries did is they used a process called impressment, which is essentially kidnapping. And here you see British press gangs in action getting new recruits. So what impressment means is that they would essentially round up all the homeless men that they could find on the streets, and they would impress upon them that they had to join the army, which means that they were knocked unconscious. And when they woke up, they were at sea, and they were given the choice to either walk the plank and drown or join the Navy, son. So this was the way that navies expanded their ranks. We also finally see some changes in agriculture in the late 18th century. And the reason why I bring this up is because it lays the foundation for something that, of course, will be incredibly transformative during the 19th century and will change the world forever, and that's the Industrial Revolution. But to get there, we need to have this mini agricultural revolution, which happens in the 18th century. So in the Middle Ages, they used a system called the three-field system, which essentially means that they would only have, if you imagine a medieval town and the land surrounding it, all the land would be divided into three. And only two chunks of the land would ever be growing crops. And every year, 1/3 of the land would be left fallow. That means that they wouldn't grow anything on it, and instead they would let the animals graze on it, and then the animals' poop would fertilize it. The reason is if you just simply grow crops on the same land year after year after year, well then all of the nutrients come out of the land and you lose productivity. However, in the late 18th century, they began to understand how certain types of crops, such as legumes, which were nitrogen rich, could actually be replenishing the land. Also beans, peas, and clover. And so if you were careful about what types of crops you actually were planting, you could keep your fields in rotation almost all the time. The other thing that was impacting agriculture in Europe was that they were getting all these new wonderful fruits and vegetables from the New World that Europeans had never had before, like potatoes, like corn, like tomatoes. These are things that Europeans didn't have prior to first contact between the Old World and the New World, but they took to them really quickly. Also, during the 18th century, an economic process began to take place which essentially disrupted the traditional social life for most people. Now, most people during the Middle Ages were peasants, and most people during the Middle Ages lived in rural areas. However, because of economic reasons in the late 18th century, and because farming was becoming more efficient, and often because the landowners who were nobles found that they could actually make the land more profitable by simply using it for sheep farming, we start to see the land being enclosed. This is a process by which actually we're literally talking about building of fences. Enclosure means that the old medieval villages that existed on the land and the relationship between a peasant and a noble, where a peasant would be given permission to farm the land for themselves in return for farming it for the noble, that whole system broke down, and peasants were forced to leave and move. And where would they go? Well, they went to cities. And so we start to see this ever increasing pool of landless peasants, most of them moving to cities, but it's this expanding population based on an expanding food supply, and yet there isn't enough work for them, that creates a labor force that could be exploited suddenly when the Industrial Revolution appears, which it will very soon. The very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution start off with the process called the putting out system. So what that was essentially was, normally during the Middle Ages, all clothing would have been made at home by someone in the household, unless you were really wealthy. And there were a very, very select few people who you might consider a tailor during the Middle Ages, but not very many whatsoever at all. So most cloth making was done at the home, and it was done, for the family itself. But overseas trade essentially stimulated production, and this created the need for more and more cloth. And one way to do it would be to essentially create a gig economy in the 18th century. So you would essentially hire peasants to produce more cloth than what they needed. And if you were an entrepreneur, you hire many, many peasants to do this for you. And then you periodically go around to all the peasants' houses and collect all of their cloth. And this is a way that you can make money. We also, though, start to see, in the interest of commercial competition, the beginnings of innovations in textile manufacturing, such as the spinning jenny, which you see here. This wooden contraption here allowed one person to speed up their work incredibly. And this little invention right here would revolutionize cloth production, and eventually this would lead to the Industrial Revolution, which would be where they start figuring out how to take human power out of the equation and start using fossil fuels to power these machines. So here you see on this map a representation of this growth of this gig economy or cottage industry, which was helping to support this growing population. So rather than farming, the changes in agriculture meant that more landless poor workers were available on the countryside to accept work as spinners, knitters, and weavers. And this, of course, is the foundation that will be needed for the Industrial Revolution to take place. And it is in the textile industry that the Industrial Revolution first takes place. It's the textile industry which is the first to industrialize. Okay, so that's it. That's our first video podcast for the course. I hope you thought that was okay, and now you can get back to doing your Netflixing or your Amazon Priming or whatever you were doing beforehand. I hope you're handling our imposed confinement okay. If you could try to read for next week chapter 17 in pages 529 to 548 in the textbook. We will be looking at the Age of Enlightenment next week, which is the final step before we get to the French Revolution.